Hello, I hope you're doing very well. Welcome to my channel. I thought I would do a quick video today about some tips for people who are struggling to learn the Force. And the reason I decided to do that is I've seen quite a lot of comments, very recently actually, seems to be more of them, in the Akai Force user group on Facebook, and also on quite a few of my tutorial videos as comments, which probably doesn't say very good things about my tutorials. But it's people saying that they're struggling to get to grips with the Force. I've spent the last 9 months learning it, and in the process of learning the Force, I learned some things about learning the Force, if that makes any sense. And so what I thought I would do is just give you 3 tips or 3 pieces of advice that might help you get to grips with it a bit quicker. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So one of the things I see people say the most on this subject is that they're struggling with the Force because of the device's complexity, which is completely understandable because when you think about it, the Akai Force isn't one device, it's actually 5 devices. It's a sampler, a sequencer, a synthesizer, a control surface, and a door, all in one box. And if you can imagine yourself walking into a new studio that was full of equipment, and you tried to simultaneously learn to use all of those things at the same time, it would obviously be really difficult to do, and it would be confusing and overwhelming. Excuse me. So my first piece of advice to anyone who is starting out trying to learn the Force now is to tackle each of those sort of internal devices individually, one at a time, before moving on to the next one, and to do it in a particular order. Now, the order that I found worked the best was to start with the sampler. So go into the factory library of the Force and just take out a drum loop and learn to load it into the sampler. Then learn to process it and to normalize it, to trim it if you need to. Then learn to chop it up into slices and apply those slices to pads to turn it into a kit. Don't try and record anything at this point, just make the kit, and then go into the track edit menu and adjust the envelopes, learn how to do that, learn how to use the pad mixer to apply effects, and basically just spend quite a bit of time taking a sample and turning it into a kit and making it sound the way you want it to, a drum sample. Then save that kit, and do exactly the same thing again, but this time do it with some sort of melodic loop, a vocal sample or a synth loop. Do the same thing, chop it up, turn it into a melodic kit, get it sounding exactly the way you want it to, and save it. And it's at that point you can then move on to the sequencer. So in that little process, you've learned exactly how the sampler works, you've learned all about kits and drum kits, you've learned how to apply effects in the mixer, that kind of thing. So there's a good basis of workflow knowledge that you've got there before you move on to the next bit. So then you move on to the sequencer and learn how to create a clip and to record a pattern into it. Then learn how to copy and paste that pattern and create a variation in that pattern using perhaps a step sequencer, or learning how to manipulate notes on the touchscreen with the clip edit menu. And with those 2 kits that you created, build a couple of variations so you've got kind of 2 scenes to work with, and then learn about clip launching and scene launching and timing correction and all that kind of stuff, so that you at the end of this process you've learned kits and the sampler, you now know how the sequencer works. That allows you to move on to the next point, which is a synthesizer. And when you're learning the synths, you now know how the sequencer works, you know how to do clips and stuff. So the only thing you need to figure out with synths is loading presets, doing some sound design. You already know how to add effects and use the mixer. So this bit should be quite fast, quite easy now, because you've accumulated the knowledge you need to get to this bit. So when you're familiar with the synths, create a little arrangement now, because you've got all of the knowledge you need to do. You know how the kits work, you know how samples work, you know how the synthesizers and the sequencer work. Make a little arrangement that has perhaps 4 or 5 scenes in it, an intro, a verse, a bridge, and an outro, something like that. And learn to trigger different clips, learn to move through the scenes and all that kind of thing until you've got that bit locked in. And now essentially you know everything you need to basically make music. You can then move over to the control surface device or facet of the Force. And to be honest, I think this is a thing that trips people up the most, because the control surface on the Force is what makes it unique to anything else. It's completely different to any other device. Maybe there's a little bit of Ableton Push 2 in there, but it's different to everything else. And what I mean by that are the things that you can do with it, like the macros. It's completely flexible. And when something's completely flexible and has no limits, that can make it quite overwhelming. So the little arrangement that you've created, your 4 or 5 scene arrangement that you created in the previous steps, just create a couple of macros, little simple things like perhaps adjusting filter cutoff or some stutter drums and some mutes and things like that. And then incorporate using the control surface, using the macros and perhaps the XY pad to play through that arrangement you've created, that little kind of 4 or 5 scene arrangement. So as you're playing through it, you do some macro twisting, mute some things in and out, mess around with the XY pad. Keep practicing that until that starts to become kind of fluid and second nature to you. So at that point, you've now learned everything that the Force can do, more or less. You can create some music and you can perform it. And this means you can move on to the 5th and final stage of the Force, which is the arranger or the DAW. And what you can do then is that arrangement that you've built and you've learnt to perform, you press record to arranger, and you record that pattern or that song that you've made into the arranger. And you capture it and you've learnt about automation and that kind of thing. Then when you're finished, you go into the arranger mode and you'll have it all laid out in front of you. You can then learn about editing tracks, adding to it if you want to. And then you can learn about exporting and basically bouncing out what is a finished song. It'll only be short and it'll probably be quite basic, but this was a learning process. So the whole thing behind that process is that at each point, you accumulate knowledge on one specific facet of what the Force can do, whilst not being overwhelmed by any of the other things. Then you put that in a box, move on to the next one. And it's a linear journey that takes you through everything the Force can do, with each bit of learning kind of setting you up or qualifying you for the next bit. And at the end of that process, if you spend a week or two doing that, you will then have a basic knowledge of everything the Force can do. And it shouldn't be overwhelming because you've treated each of the things, you've basically treated it like 5 devices. You'd have no trouble learning a sampler or a synthesizer. You're probably used to doing that already. So this just compartmentalizes it. And hopefully that linear process, that compartmentalized process will take some of the overwhelming complexity out of learning the Force. My second tip is for the kind of person, and I'm sure there's loads of them, who have already got a load of gear at home. They've got, I don't know, a bunch of synthesizers, drum machines, that kind of thing. And they've bought the Force to basically sit in the center of that and be the brain for their whole system, which it is absolutely brilliant it's doing. You can see I've got synths and things behind me. And that kind of person will order it, it will get delivered, and they'll be really excited. They'll unpack it all and get it into the studio and plug everything into it immediately and want to get it working. The problem with that is if you think of the complexity we just talked about, they're adding to that by plugging a load of synths and perhaps an audio interface or a mixer into it. So they're trying to learn all of the things that the Force can do in kind of addition to learning how to connect everything to it. So that makes the basic process of learning the Force more difficult because you've added another load of complexity to it. But there's one specific problem, or there's one specific reason why I don't think you should do that. You should spend a couple of weeks with the Force, just with everything else unplugged, just learn the Force. And this is because Force has some weird little quirks to its workflow, some things that aren't intuitive. They're a little bit confusing. And a perfect example of how that can really confuse someone who's plugging stuff into it is another of the questions we see on Facebook all the time. You get someone post saying, "Hi, I've just got my Force, I've created a clip and it's all fine, but then the volume of the synth is going up and down all the time and I can't figure out why." And the answer to that problem is always the same. What they've done is they've hit record and they've recorded their clip in, they've recorded their synth part into it, then they sat back and listened to it and thought, oh, that's too loud or it's too quiet, and they adjust the volume, not realising that they haven't turned off the record mode. So they've recorded a load of automation into that clip, which means the volume or the filter cut off or whatever it is kind of moving about all over the place. Now the Force doesn't give you any visual feedback that a clip has automation in it. So if you know the Force and you've been using it for a while and you see this happen, you go, oh, that's what that is, and you just delete the automation. But if you don't know the Force and the first thing you've done is connect a load of synths to it, there's a good chance that that weird behaviour is going to make you think, what the hell is going on here? And you're going to go down some massive MIDI fault finding rabbit hole trying to figure out why this thing isn't working right. And there's nothing wrong with the setup. It's just that you didn't realise that you'd recorded some automation in. That's just one example. There are quite a few weird little quirks to the Force that if you're learning both it and a kind of expanded system at the same time, they will trip you up and it will become frustrating. So my second piece of advice is for someone who has bought it to be a brain, before you plug anything in, just spend 2 weeks with it, doing what I said in the first bit, learn it to a good level so that anything that isn't working when you do plug things in, you will know whether it's a problem with the Force or a problem with the way you've hooked things up. My last tip is not so much a practical thing, it's actually almost a philosophical thing, which is going to sound weird. When you're looking at YouTube, you have to remember that YouTube is social media, and social media at the best of times is either just not real or not an accurate representation of what life really is. And when you see someone perform on the Force or any other device and they rattle out this perfect, flawless, fluid 3-minute performance, when you look at that and you see that, it's not that it's not true, it's not the full story. I know from experience that when I try and record a performance video, it takes at least 10 attempts for me to get that right on camera. And that isn't even counting the 20 times, that I had to rehearse it. So essentially what you're seeing is that YouTuber or that performer's one good take out of 20 failed attempts. And if you aren't kind of aware of that, you can look at these people knocking out these amazing performances and say, Nick Trikakis is a great example. He's got some of the most viewed Force videos on YouTube. And if you've looked at one of his videos and thought, I want to do that, and then a month into using the Force, you can't do it, the fact is no one can do it. I don't think anyone can play the Force like he does. It's incredibly difficult. And even when you see someone nail a performance, just bear in mind that they will have recorded that 20 times and made a load of mistakes. So what you're seeing is this fluid, lovely, kind of perfect performance. If you can't replicate that, don't worry, because that person can't replicate it every time either. So what I'm trying to say on this weird rambling bit is be kind to yourself and have expectations that are reasonable. As long as you're having fun using the Force, then it doesn't really matter. If you're making music, it doesn't matter what comes out if you're having fun with it. But don't be put off by seeing people do sort of incredible performances and not being able to replicate it, because you don't know how many days, hours, weeks or months have gone into being able to play that 3-minute thing, because all you see is the 3-minute thing. So be kind to yourself, have fun playing on it, and don't get stressed out trying to learn it, and don't give up, because it's such a rewarding instrument to play. It's well worth the time it takes to learn it. So anyway, I hope that was useful. That's not one of my normal videos, but I just thought it might help 1 or 2 people who are struggling to learn the Force. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers, bye.